Well, hello, Lee. How are you?
Hi, Namami. I'm fine. How are you?
Good, 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 good. It's good to be back to continue with the series of videos that we are doing on the stages of development as taught in spiral dynamics. In our previous video, we offered a general introduction to how Dr. Clare Graves did his research and how his teachings on spiral dynamics were introduced and then further developed by people like Don Beck and Chris Cowan and many others, and including Ken Wilber, who I think played a pretty pivotal role in making spiral dynamics more accessible and available to a lot of us. So I always want to sort of give my appreciation to Dr. Clare Graves and Don Beck and Chris Cowan, and but also Ken Wilber for sort of it's really through Ken Wilber's work that I got to know about spiral dynamics. So yeah, it's a useful tool to learn about individual and cultural evolution through a sequence of value means. Today we want to begin with beige. Beige is the first code when we don't want to use colors. In fact, sometimes that's preferred in certain settings. We could say this is the stage that is archaic. It's the sort of the archaic and the quintessential stage at which all humans begin. We all start here. For the modern global citizen, the beige can be a sort of stereotypically symbolized by the hunter-gatherer caveman or the sort of the primitive caveman or cave woman. It's said that the beige stage started around 150,000 years ago. So it's been around, it's the oldest stage of human evolution that we can connect with. At the earliest stage, there's very limited view of the world. This is like one of the defining characteristics. We don't know, in fact, that there is a world outside of us. We only really know to respond to natural biological stimuli. Hunger, am I hungry? Am I safe? Safe from threats, safe from the elements? We would most likely be kind of responding to questions like that. We would be responding to sort of very basic primal sexual urges and such. There is no ego. It's a pre-egoic stage and often pre-verbal. In fact, life isn't lived from a distinct sense of self and other. We quite literally don't have a sense of the world inside of us or even outside of us because we just don't have any reference points. All we know is what's immediately available to us. But at this stage, something that's really incredible though is that at this stage we have a very highly developed sense of instinct. We intuitively know. For example, if we were actually cave people living in the jungles or living in the woods, we would have a very intuitive, instinctive knowing of which berry could cure our belly ache and which berry could maybe kill us if we ate that. We know where the fish are in the river, not so much from a logical, rational perspective, but just an intuitive knowing. It's we instinctively know where the threats are, so our gut instincts constantly kick into gear on demand, governed by the reptilian brain, the early brain. So there isn't a capacity or even a drive to know oneself or to know others in the way that other later stages will learn how they all experience that. So our primordial value is just basic survival, and to just be, just sort of just be, almost like how my dog just bees sometimes. Um, in our previous introductory video, we talked about express self and sacrifice self. So at each stage, we sacrifice ourselves, in some cases for the collective, and in some cases, we express self at the expense of the collective. So this is the very earliest stage of that express self, except it's really important to to say that there is no real sense of a me, or a real sense of I'm expressing myself. There's just no distinct sense of a self. There's no conscious subject-object duality at this stage. In a sense, if I think of sort of what's the dignity of beige, is that capacity to fend for yourself and meet your most basic needs. You have a sense of basic awareness of how to live, how to survive, and how to just be. And we have a very pure and innocent sense of connection to our primordial ground of being. After beige, that sense of purity, little by little, begins to get contaminated to some degree, and as we try to construct a sense of self. And it's interesting that at higher stages of development, we're in a sense trying to reconnect and come back to this sense of primordial purity of being, the ground of being, from a higher level of awareness and consciousness. For most of us in this modern day and age, beige is quite foreign to us. However, as we stay in developmental psychology, and we've often mentioned this, there is that concept of transcend and include. So we definitely have it in us, and it's accessible. In fact, sometimes we need to really truly access beige. As I often say, I lived in Sri Lanka where there was a civil war. If a bomb exploded, we all needed to get to safety. And I'm sure many people in war-torn zones, from Syria to Sarajevo to Sri Lanka, we've all experienced certain times in our lives, perhaps our basic survival instinct really kicked into gear. Actually, living in the US, I live in a place where people might pull out a gun and start shooting people inside a grocery store. So at a time like that, and I think you might speak to this later also, there's just a lot of experiences in our lives, lots of natural occurrences or human-made occurrences where we really have to kick into that, get our reptilian brain kicked into gear. Once there is some basic safety, we can start to look out for others. But our natural instinctively, our gut instinct is to look out for ourselves, and that's a good thing. In beige, we have a really heightened sense of awareness of sights and sounds, because those things are necessary for our survival. In fact, in my own life, I remember when a long time ago, I did a solitary meditation retreat, solitary silent meditation retreat. So I wasn't seeing anybody else. And as the days progressed, there was one old man in the meditation center down below, who would bring food for me. I would receive one meal a day. This retreat was in the Buddhist tradition. So in the Buddhist tradition, in the Theravadan tradition, you receive one meal, which you're supposed to have just before noon. And after noon, you're not supposed to have anything solid. So in my little meditation cabin, little hut, we didn't have any kitchens or food or anything like that, no refrigeration or anything. And I remember, just because I was living all alone in this cabin, I became so attuned, very heightened awareness around my basic survival, so that food, the sense of my food's arriving, I would know exactly what time, even though I didn't have a clock in sight. So I could hear his feet rustling on the leaves as he was climbing the steps to get to my cabin. And just a very heightened sense of awareness around him leaving. The food was served on a metal plate. And I remember the metal sort of plate when he would place it on the little concrete step outside my entryway. Just all of that was I was so highly alert to all of it. It's food. It's like my basic survival need. So anyway, I just somehow feel like I was developing my sense of awareness and evolution through meditation, but also just really in a beige level in a certain sense. Where we would still see and encounter beige is in the newborn. in the elderly, the senile elderly, I guess we are sort of bookended by beige as we are born into this world and as we depart this world. War-torn areas, I guess there are still certain bands of people living in African tribes or Middle Eastern countries, South American, but in very modern countries in Western civilization also, there are bands of people that are just living in drug addiction, in severe trauma, or in certain humans that may have certain severe mental developmental disabilities, where you can't really fend for yourself. So you can really see that in solitary living or in small bands, you will definitely encounter beige. In beige, there is no economic power. Nobody in beige really holds any power, really. There's no organized religion, there's no leadership. If you think of Piaget's cognitive stages, this is the sensory motor level of cognitive development. You're experiencing the world through the senses, the five senses. I think if you can generally fend for yourself and keep yourself safe from threats, you are at a healthy stage of beige. And in fact, if you come to a stage of being sufficiently able to fend for yourself and you no longer need to be constantly fending off threats, I think that's when maybe the next stage begins. So, and we won't talk about purple today, but yeah. So just a general introduction to beige.
Yeah, wonderful, Namali. It's a great impression of the beige value meme and the world of beige. So just a few observations. And the first is that when Clare Graves and Beck were formulating the beige value meme, the consensus was that some of the first Homo sapiens, so the first human beings, lived indeed around 150,000 years ago. But the longer we progress as a human species, the more we find out about the past, of course. So the current estimates, as I understand it, lie between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago that Homo sapiens first evolved. So that would then also be the beginning of the beige meme within humans, of course. One of the things that was very beautiful about what you said was how we start from that level of beige, and there's no other level of development yet available to us. And then as we progress, as we evolve as human beings individually, but also as a species, we gain access to higher levels of development. But as you said, with the transcend and include framework, we always retain the ability to access the beige level of development. And one of the things that you and I wanted to do with these videos was to sketch how we as human beings today, alive all across the planet, can effectively integrate all of these levels. So also the beige level of existence, and indeed, as you say, physiological functioning and survival orientation. So if we look at how you and I and all of the people watching can consciously integrate beige into their lives, then I completely agree with you that if you can fend for yourself and guarantee your survival, then you're effectively integrating beige. And if we look at that in detail, then we could say that all of the things we need to function physically, so oxygen, so that would mean breathing exercises are a very good way to connect with the beige level of development, where you basically oxygenate your body through deep and regular breathing, and simple things like drinking enough water to hydrate effectively, sleeping well enough to make sure that all of the repair processes and other physiological processes can occur naturally. And of course, getting enough exercise, so getting enough movement throughout the day to keep ourselves healthy. And then, of course, within the context of beige, we could also say that anything that we do to guarantee our survival is a beige activity. So I would also say that maintaining a healthy body temperature, for instance, is also a beige activity. And staying out of the sun or applying sunscreen, things like that, are also beige activities, because to not do those things means we lower our survival chances, at least theoretically.
Yeah, during the worst of the pandemic, the most basic need to breathe was taken away from millions of people. And even more recently at this now, this is June of 2021 as we do this recording. Just a couple weeks ago, India was in the throes of the pandemic, and there were people who just dropped dead on sides of streets because they didn't have access to, they couldn't breathe. There's no access to oxygen. So yeah, basic survival. Just our need for basic survival never goes away.
Exactly. And I think you touch on a very, very good point, and that's that the pandemic is also a very beige activity. It's about survival. And also the whole vaccination process is, for the people who allow themselves to be vaccinated, it's a process of survival. And for people who are very critical of vaccines in general, or of the COVID vaccine in particular, that's also typically a beige orientation where people are typically worried about putting something into their body. So it's very body-based, I would say, the whole pandemic, and it elicits feelings of survival, indeed, in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, in some cases, the anti-vaxxers in some ways are also very conspiracy driven, and in some cases they are not taking rational view of the body. In fact, they are more driven mentally by conspiracies and such in some cases, even though I would always say there's always a valid concern for a lot of things that we put in our bodies, and to be skeptical and to be careful for sure.
Yes, that's a good point. And I would say, indeed, we were speaking about this recently, that the container, the basic theme of beige doesn't change. It's basically just a structure that holds the value meme, or that holds the level of development, but that the content of the level of development changes over time because humanity evolves. And for instance, just the knowledge that some diseases, for instance, like the plague, were caused a bacteria, a bacterium, that changes how we relate to survival and what we're willing to do, indeed, as human beings, to protect ourselves against potential threats. So that's I think that's a good addition to our dialogue. It's of course also the case that we teach children behavior related to beige survival behaviors. So for instance, toilet training of children is a very beige activity because, of course, our excrement contains a large number of viruses and parasites and bacteria. So it's useful to learn how to navigate that hygiene risk appropriately. And the same goes for hand washing, teaching children to wash hands and things like that. That's also a way in which, indeed, we socialize each other to function as best as possible within the beige level of development. In regard to hygiene, we could also say that one of the things modern people also do is keeping their houses free of pests, for instance, of rodents, because of course mice and rats carry, I think, about 30 diseases that human beings can catch from them, but also the mites and the ticks and fleas that they carry. So that's also a thing. For instance, if we're vacuuming our house, if we're vacuum cleaning the house, that's also, I would say, a beige activity. Other basic hygiene activities like washing ourselves, that would, for me, also classify as a beige activity.
In some ways, how I might see beige being quite consciously explored in a sort of modern life, it could be that beige is capable of just really, in a certain sense, just being aware in the present moment and just living in the present moment. The unhealthy version of it is just discursive meandering on autopilot. If we can catch ourselves doing that, which I know I often do, just discursive meandering on autopilot, I can sometimes switch over more consciously to being more mindfully awake in the present moment, and just meeting my basic needs and wants. That feels like another way in which we can all just access Beige, that sense of being in the moment.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. And as you were speaking, I was also thinking about another way in which the Beige level of development, especially for modern human beings, can manifest in an unhealthy way. And that's, for instance, overeating, oversleeping, over exercising, over hydrating, for instance. So I would agree. It's either the forgetting of self through inactivity, or the forgetting of self through hyperactivity that is detrimental to the survival of basically the body. Because I think we might have spoken about this in the past, that the availability, of course, of salt and sugar for modern human beings is very strange if we look at the evolution of human beings, because we're primed to be very attuned to when we can ingest fats and sugars, because they're not naturally abundant, or haven't been naturally abundant for most of humanity's past. So in the modern world, where fats and sugars for many people are abundant, it's useful to be able to manage that skillfully. So I would also say that that's also a Beige challenge, is to be able to manage those instinctual energies that reach for the taste of food and the satiation and things like that. Another very interesting thing that you said is the residing in the present that Beige can allow us to do. If you're able to abide in the present and accept the things as they are, then you can also cultivate a healthy relationship with things like physical pain, where instead of, for instance, experiencing pain as something that shouldn't be there, or that is a very negative experience, if you can just embrace the present as it is, including any physical pain or suffering that you might be experiencing, that can be a very liberating way of relating to physical pain or suffering. So that's another Beige talent, I would say, that we can apply to our daily lives. I would say we also see this in animals, where, for instance, if you have a three-legged dog, for instance, then they tend to go about their daily activities without ruminating, of course, on the fact that they're missing one of their legs. And that tends to be a very, I would say, highly functional and effective way of approaching life's challenges. Is just to embrace them and move on with whatever we still possess into the future.
Yeah. I mean, I think, just simply put, Beige doesn't go into analysis paralysis or trying to rationally understand this and that. You just don't.
Yeah. By the way, there's a very nice story about Charles Darwin, that he visited the zoo very frequently. And one of the things he would do is he would come up to one of the terraria where the snakes were kept, and he would put his face up to the glass, and the snake would attack him, or would attack the glass, and he would see if he could keep his face against the glass without instinctively moving backwards. And of all of the times he tried it, he wasn't able to override that instinctual reflex to recoil, which for me is also indeed orange playing with Beige, I would say, where you're basically trying to see whether you can override your Beige impulses. And as you were saying at the beginning, it's very good that those impulses are there, and that they're pre-verbal, and they look out for us even when we don't potentially want them to.
Yeah, that's a great story. And it just reminds me, and I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but last week it was just starting to get pretty dark, and I was walking my dog. It was like his final walk for the day. I was very close to where I live, and just, maybe 30 feet from where I live. And all of a sudden, from around a car, about 15 feet in front of me and my dog, was a bear, a black bear. Yeah. I have lived in Colorado for 20 years, and I hear of bear encounters all the time, and mountain lion as well. I think I completely froze. Like everything people say about what you're supposed to do if you encounter a bear, I had none of that available to me. I had like nothing. I completely froze. And I was so startled that I have no idea why that bear was startled as well. Like I did this kind of gasp, and incredibly, strangely, my dog has never encountered a bear either. And I would imagine he would go into a barking storm, and he didn't. Because I honestly don't know what would have happened if Duncan started barking. Because if he saw a deer, which he did 5 minutes before the bear encounter, there were deer in the neighborhood in people's backyards. And he was barking and barking and barking. And somehow when I saw the bear, he went dead silent, and I gasped, and all I could think of was just protecting my dog, really, and myself. And I ran, which is exactly what you're not supposed to do when you see a bear. I just ran for my life. And I'm just lucky that somehow this bear walked in the opposite direction, kind of got behind another car. So in some ways, maybe the bear also was protecting himself. Anyhow, yeah. But I had a very real visceral sense of that survival, need for survival.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And indeed, I would also say that the fight, flight, freeze, fawn mechanics that each of us has access to are all very beige in nature.
Yes. Instinct, the gut instinct.
Yeah. And apparently, I mean, you chose the right one because the situation was diffused successfully. So I think, indeed, to trust our instinct, indeed, even if we worry that we might have not done the right thing, is I think is a very wise to trust in instinct, indeed.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you're lucky you are in Amsterdam. You wouldn't encounter a bear. I don't think so.
In the zoo, we would. There are bears indeed, but there are no bears in the streets. That's very true.
Yeah,
that's true.
Right.
And in that vein of being confronted with a survival threat, basically, I would also say that the things that people do, like riding roller coasters and jumping off cliffs with wingsuits and bungee jumping, that those are all ways in which we experience in a relatively safe way the beige level of development going crazy within ourselves and saying, oh, this is very dangerous and this is not good. And the same way perhaps in which if we watch horror movies, can also access that same feeling of something's very wrong at the survival level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Next time, we will go into the world of purple, or in Ken Wilber's language, magenta. And by the way, I guess we didn't mention this in the beginning. In Ken Wilber's language, a beige is referred to as infrared,
yeah.
Which is almost like a no color that a human can actually see. Thanks for joining, Lee. We'll see you next time.
Okay, bye everyone.